Hey, I just wanted to apologize ahead of time for the audio quality in this episode. I am doing the best I can, but the internet connection here in China leaves a lot to be desired. Hopefully, I will be in a new country soon where I don't have all these connectivity issues, and I appreciate y'all's patience.
You studied abroad at university, you went to work for a little bit, got hit by a car, uh, reevaluated some things in your life. And when you bought that one way ticket to Singapore, did you have the intention to come back to the US?
Welcome to the Picky Girl Travels podcast. I'm Adelia Borashade. As you know, this podcast is for women looking to live life on their own terms. For some of us, like myself, it can take years, hell, even decades before getting to a place of confidence and comfort where what other people think about how you live your life no longer matters. This week on the podcast, you will hear from someone who was able to reach that point in her life just a few years after graduating college. And as a result, she was able to turn a love of travel and helping other people into a full-blown international career.
We are chatting today with Carille Guthrie. She is a documentary photographer, an architect turned logistics and construction manager, and a rugby fanatic. She's visited at least 59 different countries and lived in Thailand, Kenya, Australia, New Zealand, Kyrgyzstan, Sri Lanka, and I feel like I'm missing some other African countries in there. Did I get them all?
Also Sierra Leone and South Sudan and Ethiopia.
Okay, I felt like that list was not was not complete. You've kind of taken a very unique route, and that's one of the reasons I really wanted to chat with you. Your expat story is not straightforward. How did you first go abroad the very first time to live, not like as to travel?
Well, my traveling kind of segued into living when I was about 29 years old. I quit my job and went on an around the world backpack trip. And so part of that included tourism, but I also scheduled a couple of volunteer vacations in that trip. And I had no particular destination or end time frame, but I did have like a volunteer vacation scheduled in Thailand and one in Kenya. And so when I eventually ran out of money, I came back to the US and I wanted to find a job where I could continue to travel, but I could also do some good for people in need. And that's when someone recommended that I look at Doctors Without Borders, because obviously they need doctors and nurses, but they also have a logistics side. So they needed people to do minimal construction and pretty much planning of all of their overseas projects. So that's how I got involved with my very first Doctors Without Borders assignment, which was 10 months in Kenya.
Let's back up a little bit. You said you were volunteering. So was that part of a structured program, or was that just something you did on your own?
When I knew that I was going to quit my job in the US and travel, I can't remember how I stumbled upon volunteer vacations, but eventually I found volunteer vacations. And so I booked a one-way flight to Singapore from DC, and I chose to do a volunteer vacation in Thailand. And so what I did in between Singapore and Thailand, I got to kind of just ramble about and eventually get to that Thailand volunteer vacation. But I figured that if I didn't have plans for my travel, I should at least have a plan for the volunteering, because I didn't want to end up in the middle of nowhere and, they're like, oh, well, this program doesn't really exist. Turns out they took your money. So, I did do research on that, and I found specific programs that I could volunteer at for specific lengths of time.
The fees involved with that include a special kind of visa, work, or volunteer in the country?
So there's a lot of controversy behind volunteer vacations. I recommend personally that there's a minimum amount of research that you need to do when you're volunteering. Typically, everybody who volunteers goes on a tourist visa, because you're not working, you're volunteering. So they're not paying you. But the thing that you do need to research is, above all, where is your money going? Because there are a lot of websites out there that kind of glorify the experience, and you get there and you find out that 95% of your money went towards publicity, towards the website fees, and basically the cause that you're trying to support. It's kind of like the kids are living in squalor, or they're purposely keeping, if you're working with kids, they're purposely keeping children living in subpar conditions so that they can continue to get volunteers in. So that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't recommend that anyone going on a volunteer vacation works with children, because not only could that be continuing the cycle of that particular, maybe it's an orphanage or just a child care facility, but also it's a bit traumatic for the kids to see all these people come in every 1 or 2 weeks, and continually have to say hello and goodbye to all of these strangers.
With the work that you were doing, and there is a fee associated with, being able to volunteer, because of course that's how the organization makes money. But so if somebody were to choose that route, you've got to also budget in like money to eat, money to do things on top of the fees associated with the program. Is that correct?
I think it all depends on the program. The ones that I did all included food and housing. So I only had to pay for any outside excursions that I did. And they all picked me up at the airport and then transported me to the project. So that's also another thing that you want to research. You want as much on the ground support as you can get, especially if you're going to be outside of the capital and in some very rural places. So I did 2 vacations in Thailand, 1 in South Africa, and 1 in Kenya. And all 4 of those programs housed and fed me.
Now, I find it really interesting that you were at the beginning of your career. This is when you were an architect, correct?
Construction manager.
Okay. So you're at the beginning of your career and you say, okay, I'm going to quit this job and I'm going to buy a one-way ticket to Singapore. Were you worried about like any negative impacts on your career from doing that?
I was at the beginning. I had been working in commercial construction for about 4 years. And one day on the way to work, I was driving my motorcycle and a car hit me dead on. And I flipped over the car, broke my wrist, my toe, and blah, blah, blah. So that was actually what gave me the impetus to say that, you could die at any minute. It was a come to Jesus moment.
Okay.
It was like, well, what am I doing? I'm going to work every day. I could be traveling.
Wait. Okay, because you're playing down this whole motorcycle. Like, yeah, I was hit by a car. No big. You were in this accident, and that made you kind of reevaluate some things.
Exactly.
Talk about that a little bit. So you were like, life is short. I don't want to come to this job anymore.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of European countries already have that gap year where after university, you take a year off when you're typically about 19 to travel and backpack, and then you go into your full-fledged career. So we don't really do that in the US, but I was aware of it. And like I said, I went straight from college to this job, and I was only 4 years in. But at the time, I wasn't really jiving with my boss. He was making work pretty difficult. And at that point, I was just like, well, I don't need this. I could be doing something better.
I thought you had you didn't do a study abroad while you were in university?
I did, yeah. I went to the University of Sydney.
Could you talk about that? I think one of the reasons I wanted to have different expats on here to talk about their experience, because I think there is a very common perception that if you want to move abroad, it's something you do and it's got to be like a permanent thing. And I want to show people that, hey, you know, it can take different shapes. Like it could be a study abroad kind of thing. It could be where you volunteer long term for, you know, several months, a couple of years. You know, there are different ways that this journey could shake out. So would you mind talking about the study abroad program you did?
I was studying architecture, and I chose to study abroad in my 4th year. And architecture is a 5-year program, so that pretty much limits the amount of schools I can go to, because I had to go to school with an architectural program so that I could graduate on time. I chose the University of Sydney because, one, I also needed them to speak English because I wasn't trying to go to a university and through courses in a foreign language. But also there was that rugby connection. I've been playing rugby. At that point, I've been playing rugby for, 4 years or so. So Australia was at the top of my list. I went to Howard University, and they do have a full study abroad program and office and advisors and everything. But because my route was so specific, it turned out that I had to unenroll from university so that I could do the study abroad. And before I did that, I made sure that the dean of architecture and my architecture advisor signed off on all of the classes that I was going to be taking. I think I took 4 classes there. And so we made sure that those classes would transfer as electives or my main design course, so that when I came back, I didn't miss a beat. So yeah, I created my own study abroad program.
And you were in Australia for what, just 1 semester?
Yeah, the other thing that you have to kind of logistically figure out is if you're going to someplace in the southern hemisphere, their school semesters are the reverse. So really I could only do the 1 semester if I wanted to come back and jump back into the northern hemisphere school schedule.
You studied abroad at university, you went to work for a little bit, you know, got hit by a car, reevaluated some things in your life. And when you bought that one-way ticket to Singapore, did you have the intention to come back to the U.S.?
I knew that I would come back eventually because, again, only 4 years out of college, I had a limited amount of funds. So the things that I pre-planned prior to departure were that first ticket to Singapore. I had the 2 volunteer vacations in Thailand. I also had a ticket booked from Bangkok to New Zealand, and I had a work holiday visa in New Zealand already processed and granted. So those were the only things that I knew that I was doing. And then everything else I kind of made up on the fly. But I knew that I would be able to earn some money when I went to New Zealand because I was allowed to work.
How hard was that, or how difficult was that process to get the work holiday visa in New Zealand?
It was super simple. I think at the time it cost maybe somewhere in between like 25 or 50 US dollars. So relatively cheap considering it's a 12-month visa. And the process is all online. The requirement at the time was that you had to have no criminal background and you had to be under 30. And literally, those are the only 2 requirements. So super simple to get.
Oh, wow. And did you anticipate, well, maybe being there for the whole 12 months?
I did, yeah, I did. And I ended up leaving a bit early just because the World Cup was on in South Africa. And my friends were like, hey, you should meet us here. So I said, okay. But yeah, so I left maybe 10 months into my 12-month visa.
Okay, so what kind of work did you do?
I got super, super lucky. So I had never worked any retail or service industry jobs. I figured, how hard could it be, you know? So, I hit the pavement and tried to get a job at restaurants and at cafes and bars, and they were like, no, we don't have time to train you. Oh, oops. So I happened to be staying at a hostel where the owners of the hostel were friends with a couple who owned the basketball team for the city. So New Zealand has a national basketball league, and Christchurch, where I was, had a basketball team in that league. And the owners of the basketball team were a husband and wife. The wife was from California, and the husband had met her in California. And the hostel owner introduced me to the basketball couple, and they were like, hey, we're looking for a general manager, and bam. So I became the general manager for a professional basketball team while I was there.
Again, you're just so nonchalant about all of this stuff. Oh yeah, I was there on a work holiday visa and became a general manager of a professional basketball team. Okay. So what was that like?
I'm really into sports, so it was really cool to work for a sports team. And actually, when I came back to the U.S., I tried to get back into the sports field, but obviously in the U.S. you need way more of a background than you do in New Zealand. But I really enjoyed, it was literally, I was getting paid to go to basketball games. So that was really cool. I enjoyed it.
So this is still on that initial trip. You went to South Africa. From there, how did you end up coming back to the United States? You mentioned okay, money was becoming an issue. How long were you gone total?
In total, I spent 18 months abroad, and I was able to hit 15 countries.
Not bad at all. When you got back to the US, did you try and jump back into working here, living, oh, I say here like I'm there, working there, living there, or did you come back thinking, I got to figure out what I can do so I can leave again?
The requirements of the work holiday visa that I got were that in the 12 months, you can only have one job for a maximum of 6 months. So basically in 12 months, you can have 2 jobs or 20, but a minimum of 2 jobs. So I did the basketball job and pretty much had to leave because the visa was expiring and the basketball season was over anyway. But before I left, I had spoke to the owners about coming back for the next season and trying to get them to sponsor a visa, because at that point I had every intention of continuing to manage a basketball team. But when I got back to the US, they were trying to work through the logistics of sponsoring my visa. And then in Christchurch, they had a massive earthquake that killed a lot of people and pretty much shut the city down. And you couldn't have sports teams after an earthquake because no one's going to any games. Yeah. So they couldn't sponsor the visa. I couldn't go back to the city. They're still trying to rebuild the city. And I think that was almost 10 years ago, maybe 7 years ago. So at that point, then I had to say, oh, okay, so what's plan B? And that's when I discovered Doctors Without Borders needed logistics.
When I think Doctors Without Borders, I think, okay, well, yeah, if I'm a doctor or if maybe I'm a nurse, you worked in logistics. What other kinds of positions, or if somebody wanted to be a part of such an organization, but they are not a medical worker, are there any other options for them besides logistics and construction?
Yeah, that's a great question. They take a variety of different trades. So, for example, IT is a big one. Electricians and mechanics, because there are a lot of cars in Doctors Without Borders. Every project has at least 3 cars. So that's a big one. They also take, I think, social workers, mental health professionals, and the biggest of the non-medical is the logistics. Construction is kind of small, but I would say the biggest is logistics, and then second largest is water and sanitation. So they do take engineer.
You know, because that's a common question that I see a lot, is people who don't teach, and maybe people who are not in IT looking for employment abroad and trying to figure out, well, you know, how can they use the skill set that they have. Now, Doctors Without Borders, that's an NGO, isn't it?
Yes, it is. They typically respond to any kind of natural disaster or public health crisis whenever the country that the crisis is in is not able to provide the citizens with the medical response that they need. So most likely that's HIV or AIDS, tuberculosis, cholera, Ebola, and sometimes natural disasters like the earthquake in Haiti. But typically, when there's a natural disaster like an earthquake, you need infrastructure help and not so much medical.
Does that mean that your time working with them was not super glamorous?
Definitely. It is depending on your project, but it can be a very difficult job. You typically work in very remote locations. For one assignment, I flew into the capital, then we drove to another spot, spent the night. In the morning, drove to the border crossing, which we had to take a canoe across. That's the first time I've ever crossed a border in a canoe. And then we drove some more. So like sometimes from the capital, it can take you a day to get to your project site, depending on where you're going. But not only are you remote, but you have limited resources. One of the best things that I think Doctors Without Borders provides is local jobs. So if you've got a project with 100 people on it, maybe 5 of them are expats, and the other 95 are all local employees, local hires. Essentially, only the managers are the expats. So I do appreciate that they provide so many jobs to locals.
So it would, who would you recommend that kind of experience for? What kind of person?
People who thrive under high pressure situations and aren't easily intimidated or frazzled by low resources. I don't know how the medical field is, but coming from commercial construction, I come in and time is money. And so you get into these projects and you're trying to get something done by the end of the day, and that's just not how it works in that particular location. So you kind of have to pole pole is what they say in Swahili. Just take it slow, calm down. You have to ease into whatever the local culture is. So you definitely have to be adaptable. And again, you have to be able to work essentially in isolation. I mean, you do have coworkers, and we all live together. They provide housing, and pretty much everybody is typically in the shared house. But your internet might not be the best. You definitely can't really stream until like after midnight. So there's no FaceTiming anybody. At least you can Facebook and WhatsApp, but you're essentially out there by yourself with a bunch of strangers. So you have to be able to adapt to that situation.
That internet situation sounds like mine, and I'm in a city of almost 8 million people. So that gets very frustrating. Now, the assignments with Doctors Without Borders, because you did more than one, do they vary in length?
Yeah, it's all dependent upon the project. So let's see. My first assignment was HIV and AIDS in Kenya. That was for 10 months. My second assignment was, why am I blanking? Laos. Was 3 months in Laos, and that was a maternal health. And I was just working at a district hospital out in the middle of nowhere in Laos. Third assignment in Ethiopia, and that was working with South Sudanese refugees crossing the border into Ethiopia. That was considered an emergency, and so when you're on an emergency project, it's a 7-day-a-week work day, so they typically don't. So I was there for 3 months. And I also did tuberculosis in Kyrgyzstan. That was 3 months. I did an Ebola project in Liberia. That was 6 weeks. I did another refugee project in South Sudan. That was 9 months. Last year was fully construction. So I was building a hospital in Sierra Leone for 9 months.
I think we didn't mention Laos when we mentioned the list of all the places that you'd lived. It's just so much. Now, the length of those projects, do you know that going in?
There's a pool. Let's say I'm a construction manager. There's a pool of construction managers, and projects will say, hey, in 4 months, I need a construction manager to do X, Y, and Z for 6 months. And so then I actually have to compete with the other people in the construction management pool for that assignment. So maybe in that time that it's open, I'm not available, so I'm out. But that itself sends out a notice that, hey, I have this availability for this amount of time. And then HR will give you options and say, hey, which one do you want me to submit you for?
I don't know a more polite way to ask this, but when you were with Doctors Without Borders, is that a paid position?
Well, they do pay you, but it's considered volunteer work. And so when I started like 7 years ago, I'm sure the pay scale has changed, but when I started 7 years ago, they paid you after taxes. I think you got about $1,200 a month. So it's not a lot. And that actually limits the amount of American doctors who can participate, because if you've got student loans and debt to pay from medical school, then $1,200 a month is not going to cut it. So the first 12 months that you're in the field, and this is contract work, right? So if I'm not on contract, then I'm not getting paid, and they're not registering my time either. So I was in Kenya for 10 months. So that means I had 10 months in the field. At the time, it was 3 months. So those first 2 months, I was still at 1,200 pay scale. And then on your 13th month, they essentially double your pay. So I went up to like 2,400 on month 13, up by like $60 or something. I mean, yeah, it's 100% funded by donations, so they don't really have the money to spend on the employees.
It is what it is. I was just curious, and I imagine anybody listening would also be curious, because I really don't know much about Doctors Without Borders, really, other than they show up, with doctors when there's a problem somewhere. So thank you for sharing that.
I should say that do pay very well for the local staff that they hire. So they pay pretty much like a European minimum wage. And when you're living, in the bush of Kenya or Ethiopia or South Sudan, then you're getting paid very well as a local hire.
So you are no longer working with Doctors Without Borders.
I just started a new job, and the beginning of February, and now I'm doing a version of construction management for the U.S. State Department.
People often think of the State Department as an avenue to go abroad, but usually in a different field than the one that you're in. Now, if, how did you end up, like, so you were done with Doctors Without Borders and you were like, hey, maybe I should apply at the U.S. State Department?
So I have a friend who is already a facility manager in the State Department, and she was instrumental in the whole process, because first of all, when they open up a job vacancy, it's open for maximum 2 weeks, it's 1, maybe 2 weeks. So if you don't see that vacancy, then you're out, you can't apply. So she would always say, hey, there's another vacancy open. And they do have, I can't remember, I think it's 7 different specialty or specialist tracks in the State Department. I cannot tell you what they are, but they're on the website. And one of them is facilities manager, and one is construction. What is it called? Construction. It's not construction engineer. Maybe it's just construction specialist, something like that. So my friend told me, hey, the vacancy is open. I applied. I did not hear back from the State Department for another 8 months after I submitted my online application. So I essentially gave up, and I was like, well, I guess I didn't get that job. And 8 months later, they sent me an email and said, hey, can you come next week for this interview, right? Because of course, I'm now on their timeline, so I got to hurry up and interview. But thankfully, the interview process is very immediate. When you go to the interview, by the end of the day, they will tell you whether or not, and the provision of that hire is conditioned upon you passing a background check, a medical check, and a suitability check. And then based upon your own personal history, I think the medical check is the easiest to pass as long as you don't have any serious medical conditions. That one took me maybe just like a month just to get all the paperwork in the right order. The background check for me was extensive because there's a travel section. And they don't
you'd already been like everywhere.
Exactly. It was a 10-year travel history, down to describe, if there is no address, then describe from a landmark how to get to the place that you lived.
Wow.
And, so like,
wow.
It was, for me, it was rough. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So that's for me. And then once you pass that, then you get your security clearance, and then there's a final panel that goes ahead and reviews your entire package, and then they say, yes, okay, you can work for us, or no, you can't. And actually, I did not get hired directly by the State Department. They rejected me because I had been to Cuba twice, and I did not have all my paperwork in order. This is the first time that I had really dealt with the government. So when they say I need to see all your paperwork, like, they're serious. And I kind of just given them a page here and there. So they said, no, you didn't, because there's that embargo with Cuba. So, you need to provide the sufficient information to show that you have legally traveled to Cuba. And in the first round, I did not give them all that information. I also had a foreclosure on my house from when I went backpacking and stopped paying my mortgage. So that was also a red flag.
Woo, extensive. You were not kidding.
But I was a little worried about it, and sure enough, that came back to bite me. So they were like, no, you're not financially responsible, because they're looking for people who won't be able to manage government funds, right? So it's very important that you pay off all your debts, you file your taxes, blah, 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 blah. So they didn't hire me. But from the time that I submitted my application to the time that they rejected me took 2 years. It was a full 2 years that I was trying to get this job. At some point, I did kind of give up and start looking at other jobs with other agencies like UNICEF or the UN, and even back in the United States. But my friend at the State Department said that there are plenty of contractors that the government uses to fill positions. And so she gave me 2 different contractors, and I saw a position open on their website, applied in November, and by February, I was in Sri Lanka. So it was a much different process, and ended up with state anyway.
Okay, so that's what I was just going to say. Like, hold up. So you're a government contractor for the State Department, but the State Department wouldn't hire you.
Exactly, yes.
You got this new job in February, right about the time the apocalypse started. Yeah. So how's that?
I had 2 full weeks in Sri Lanka before they shut it down, and they shut it down. Like, grocery stores are closed, pharmacies are closed, no one's allowed on the streets. So I fortunately, took 1 trip down the coast the first weekend that I was here. And the second weekend, I laid low, and then there was no third weekend. So I have not done any real exploring in the city or the country even.
And how are things now? Because it's June. Are y'all still on lockdown?
They have now eased the restrictions. The best part about being on an island when there's something like this, an outbreak, is that it's much easier logistically to cut off the outside world. So they cut off flights very quickly, and I don't know if there's any boat travel. I think maybe closer to India there is, but they shut the airport down. And once you isolate everybody inside the country, then it's pretty easy to manage the virus. And they have a very good healthcare system. It's universal healthcare, and so they're able to provide treatments. We have to date, I think, 1,600 the last 2 weeks that they've been trying to repatriate. That our cases have actually skyrocketed. So in the last 2 weeks, we've had almost 1/3 of the confirmed cases being flown in. So we'll see what the government does with that. But for now, we can walk on the streets, but we just can't leave the island and expect to return.
So how long do you think you'll be in Sri Lanka?
I am on a 2-year contract this time. So this will be the longest time that I've ever spent on a broad contract.
Do you have a preference? Do you think you might like a longer contract, or do you think you might prefer shorter ones?
I have been pretty transient, and so I think at this particular stage, I'm turning 40 this year. So another reason why I stopped Doctors Without Borders is that I need to get my 401k up. $2,500 a month is my cause. So at this point, the long-term government contracts are pretty in keeping with how I envision myself up to retirement.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to save for retirement on that amount. It's not something that I looked for when I move abroad, not something I really even thought about. But I feel like somebody listening to this might want to know, the countries that you have lived in, are there any you would say were particularly safe for Black women or particularly unsafe? Because see, like, I didn't think about that stuff at first. I just kind of went, but other people apparently take their safety a little bit more seriously than I took mine. So that's why I ask.
I will say that of the 59 countries that I've traveled to, I'd say at least 45 of them I've been to solo. I typically travel by myself because it's hard to coordinate with other Americans when you're trying to do international travel. And in that entire time, I haven't really felt in danger in very many places. Was almost pickpocketed senses went off, and I said, "Hey, so I think someone's touching my purse." So crisis averted. But I also haven't been to any countries that people consider particularly dangerous, like
South Sudan.
Oh, I mean, yeah, okay.
Yeah, wait, hold on. Let's back up here, because I think you've been to a couple that people would rank as quote unquote dangerous.
But nobody's trying to be an expat in South Sudan if you're not an NGO worker. So, I mean, that's so far from people's radar to go and live. So, okay, for instance, South Africa, Johannesburg, I did have my radar up, because walking around the streets, like you mentioned in the very, very beginning, I do photography, but I just didn't want to pull out my camera in downtown Joburg. I thought that would be a pretty bad idea. In fact, I didn't even really want to pull out my phone, because I use Google Maps to navigate. So I would step inside a store to try to figure out where I was going. But there was no like direct confrontation of, hey, give me your money or anything like that. On my part, I just consider that being a savvy traveler and streetwise.
Yeah.
So I have been fortunate, and I haven't had too many experiences where I've been threatened at all.
Like I said, I don't necessarily think about travel or the countries that I choose to live in. I don't necessarily think about them in those terms, but I know that there is a segment of the population that are particularly concerned about that. So I thought I'd ask. I looked at your photos and I think they're gorgeous. Is that something that how did you get into taking pictures?
I'd always been interested in photography, but I never really pursued it. I tried in college, but the photography class was every single year. It was always at the same time as our architecture design studio, and I can't not take design. So I could never take a class in college, and it wasn't really until they improved digital cameras that I stepped up my game. When I did that very first assignment with Doctors Without Borders in Kenya, my dad came to visit me for Christmas, and he brought me a DSLR camera, and that just kicked everything. And we went on a safari, so it's like the best time to have your first camera. It's just on safari. I just took millions of pictures.
Do you think that you might ever use that as a way to support yourself while abroad?
I think that I might put together a coffee table book, but I don't think that I will ever set up a studio and take portraits or anything like that. I have done some professional gigs, and I prefer street photography, where I just sit on a corner and check out a scene and see what happens. So in that way, I think that I can, as an outsider, and I've done some American photography, but as an outsider, I think I get a different perspective on the street scene. So, some of the market scenes that I like to take, potentially lives in Colombo, wouldn't necessarily think that interesting. But for me, this is, it's a Colombian or a Sri Lankan apple, So
yeah.
I just kind of have a different perspective. I think that helps my photographic eye.
Are you single?
I am, yes.
Okay, so then you know what's coming next. You know where this conversation is going. Again, this is not something, heck, I live in China, so we know I'm not trying to date anybody. But there are people where, you know, as part of their moving abroad plan, they would like to find love. So that makes me obligated to ask, what's dating like?
It has not gone well for me. And, you know, if you're in a place for 3 months, then, I mean, you're looking for a fling at that point. Nothing really substantially can come from that. Although there are a lot of relationships that blossom within Doctors Without Borders, and that's across all nationalities. So it's not that people don't find partners in that job and where I'm assigned. So, you know, I'm in Sri Lanka this year. Next year, I could be in Mongolia. You know, it's not up to me. So I can't really do anything to facilitate dating on that end. So, you know, it is what it is. I do like to get active in the community. So one of the things that I was able to do before the lockdown was to go out and got to meet some of the rugby community, you know, kind of develop a friend group at least. That's one of my ways that I try to put myself out there.
Okay. Do you anticipate repatriating to the U.S. like ever?
I don't know. I've not, because all of my contracts have been so short term, I haven't really had to make any long-term goals. At this point, I'm solely focused on getting my 401k up to where it should be. I want to see at the end of 10 years, so that'd be 5 2-year contracts, see where my 401k is. Because right now I have zero expenses really. So I should be able to do a lot of savings. And then at that time, I can maybe see what I want to do. I do have a storage locker full of...
If somebody wanted to get into the field that you work in, logistics and or construction management, where would they start?
For construction management, you really do have to have a background in architecture, structural, civil, or mechanical engineering. There's really no way around that, because without that background, you'll have no idea what's going on. Which isn't to say that I know everything mechanical, but I know a little bit. So that's pretty limiting. Just so specifically with Doctors Without Borders, one of the reasons that they hired me was because I had international work experience. Because as a manager in logistics, you'll be working, logistics typically has one of the biggest staff. So they want to make sure that you're not going to clash with the culture, have culture shock. So international worker list, but any kind of managerial would be a plus for that.
Well, thank you for chatting with me and sharing your experience. I think it'll be really helpful to anybody who listens to this that's looking for some adventure, some non-traditional ways to see the world. Definitely that. If somebody wanted to connect with you online or follow your work or follow your path, is there any place they can do that?
Yeah, sure. My website is CarilleGuthrie.com, CarilleGuthrie.com. And on Instagram, I'm Carille1.
Thank you for listening. Be sure to check out the show notes for links to Carille's IG and photography, along with other resources that were mentioned in this episode. I'd like to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed and those of you who've left reviews of the podcast. If you haven't left a review yet, please consider doing so. Your reviews help other women find the show and benefit from it. I also want to give an extra special shout out to those of you who've signed up on Anchor to be a monthly patron of the show. I am beyond grateful for your support. I'm working on a few ideas right now to show you just how grateful I am. So give me a little while, but I do want to express my gratitude to you all. If you're interested in supporting the podcast with a small financial contribution, and I'm talking small like $1 a month, you can do so using the link in the description. Thanks again, everybody. I'll talk to y'all next week. As y'all know, I've been doing a series here on the podcast of interviews meant to help aspiring expats, future immigrants, explore ways that they can support themselves while living abroad. And in that vein, I reached out to Carissa, who has lived and worked in Malaysia, Cuba, Japan, and Ireland, in hopes that she would share her story. Well, instead of just sharing her story, she proposed a conversation with a group of friends that she has that all worked abroad as well. And I was like, okay, fine, the more the merrier. And what I got was, this incredible story of a tight-knit tribe of Black women who found each other working in, of all places, Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and ended up creating a sisterhood that has spanned countries all over the globe. And you'll get to hear that conversation in a second. But their relationship got me really to think about the nature of community. And when I say community, I'm talking about, those people in your life, you have their back the same way that they have yours, okay? And I'll speak from my personal experience. I am the youngest of three, but I was basically raised as an only child. And on top of that, I'm an introvert who doesn't trust people or depend on other people. So I can't say that I've really had much sense of community for most of my life. So I think that's what really intrigued me by hearing them talk. But what I do know now that I didn't know before is that having community is vital. Community also is not limited to the people who are physically where you are, as these ladies definitely prove. Their sistership strengthened over thousands of miles across different continents, and that speaks to the value and the importance of community. As Black women, we have a lot stacked against us, from white supremacy, structural racism, misogynoir, medical bias, the list goes on. And when you look at it, we really only have each other, okay? This is true for those of us that live abroad, but this is also true if you live in the U.S. I know I sure as hell did not expect to find community when I moved out of the United States 4 years ago, but that's exactly what happened. I now have in my life some incredible Black women who I just never imagined I would meet. Maybe it's living this life that I do now unencumbered by so much of what it is to be a Black woman in the U.S. Maybe I was able to more easily connect with other people and form these relationships, or maybe it was just sheer luck. I don't know, but I am thankful for those women that I have gotten to know, and I'm excited for y'all to hear this conversation.